Yesterday we were looking at the HTTP protocol, and so let's continue with that. So yeah, we understood a few parts, few things here, and one was looking at the HTTP protocol. Yeah, it's a request response based protocol. It's a stateless protocol. And so what's exactly done? We have a request being sent from a client. Right? It's a client who initiates a connection, sends a request, and then the server will give a response to it. Okay. We had looked at the syntax or the format of the request which is sent by the client. Okay. So a typical HTTP request. Okay. Request, right? So a request, how does it look like? It has a request line, and request line would have a method, then some resource, and then protocol version. Okay. This is then followed by a number of header lines, headers. Okay. Then blank line for end of headers. Okay. And then in some cases, depending on the method, you might have a content also. Fine. Content part optional. Okay, that's your blank line. And there's a blank line and then a content part. Okay, fine. Headers are there typically, which are just information about the browser, information about the user. Fine. Information about even the user's preferences could also be included in certain headers. Okay, fine. For example, uh, you might have indicated in a browser setting or to the client when you would like to indicate to the server that I would like to prefer the content coming in a particular language. Fine, your first preference would be so and so, second preference is so and so. Fine, you could have your language country settings, fine, being communicated to the server. So all those things go through headers. Okay, and there are headers to indicate. Yes, so we got typical headers which can go in a request. Okay. And once the request is received by the server will have its own processing, fine, and then server will give a response. What is the response looking like? Yeah, what does the response look like? Typically, response. Yeah, what does the response look like? It again has a response line. First line, what's the first line? It will first talk of protocol version, fine, then a status code, 3-digit status code, and message, some message. Okay, this is then again followed by headers, but these are headers which are for response. Fine, there are headers which are related to response. There will be common headers which are common to both request and response, and especially there will be headers which are just about describe metadata for the content. So if there is a content, there's a certain set of headers which would be included. Okay, what is the type of content? Fine, the content length. Fine, the encoding. What is the encoding used in the content? So any such things, which character set, because it's a text based, so which character set is being followed in the content part. Okay, fine, such information may be included through headers. So we have headers. So you even have specific headers just for describing the content part. Okay, so that's something which will be, those headers will come if you have content. Okay, there'll be headers in especially in response, there are headers which will be dependent on the status code also. Okay. Fine. So you'll have headers in response which are again dependent on status code. Okay, fine. Let's look at this status code thing. But anyway, the typical syntax is similar. Fine. You have that first line, you have the headers, number of headers, then it is followed by blank line. Okay, you'll have a blank line. Fine. And after the blank line, you'll have the content, which comes from the server. So server's response will be on these lines. Okay, fine. There are certain headers which are just dependent on what status code you're having. Fine. For example, let's see some sample status codes. Okay. Before that, we have something like categorization of the status code. Status codes are 3-digit codes. Okay, your status code would be 3-digit. So let's look at the status codes. Okay, a 3-digit number. Okay, now the status codes are like this, categorized like this. You have one, I'll put it as 100 to 199. Okay, not all the codes may be used, but this is a category which is related to informational. So if that's the status code being sent, that means this response is just about giving some information. Okay, then it's basically normally an intermediate response. Fine. The most commonly found is 200. Okay, but this category 200 to 299. Okay, rather you can say 2xx, 1xx, 2xx. Okay, xx is from 00 to 99. This is about successful. Your request was processed successfully, and here is a successful response coming to you. Fine. Normally, the response code which you normally receive is 200. Okay. The message is corresponding to this. See, message here, after the status code, the message which is there is just dependent on your status code. According to the status code, you are getting a message. Okay. Then we have the third category, which is 300 to 399. These are normally for redirection. You have requested a resource. Okay, whatever resource which you have requested, fine, it's not to be processed here. You are being redirected to a different URL. Okay, redirected to a different location. Fine. So how does it redirect you to a different location? So here it will use there are different codes here. Fine, 301 is moved. Fine, there's one for temporarily moved permanently, and all such codes are there, right? So 300, 301, 302, all those things are used. Okay, so these are nothing but redirections. But remember, whenever there is a redirection, the header associated with redirection. So if it is giving a redirection, there'll definitely be a header called location. So you got a header called location. So a header is typically header name, colon, space, and the URL. So the URL which will have this. Fine. See, typically if you say google.com, what happens? It's not the google.com which is going to process and give it to you. It says, oh, take this resource. Since you are coming from India, fine, take the resource. Fine, let this be resource be searched and things be given to you from google.co.in. It's a redirection. Okay, it's typically the response which is received by the browser is 301 redirected. fine. And then along with that, the header which has come is saying, fine, the header is location, and it is giving google.co. And therefore, the browser, again, when it receives such a response, the browser is not waiting for you to say, okay, go and redirect. The browser on its own does the redirection, fine, starts and makes the second connection for you. Okay, fine. So that's a redirection. And then we have the third category, 400 to 499. Fine. Your request has a problem. Fine. Request error. There's some problem with your request. Fine. For example, very commonly 404 file not found. What you are looking for, that resource is not existing. You have a wrong request here. Fine. Or 401, oh, you are not authorized. Certain resources would require even authentication, right? You have not even been authenticated, or even if you have authenticated, you are not the one who is authorized. So there are different codes for different request related errors. You are requesting something, you are not authorized, fine. So that's an error. Okay, fine. That's the 4xx. And then the final one is the 500 to 599. This is server errors. Your request was fine. Okay, fine. What you have hit is a valid resource. You can ask for that resource. But during the processing on the server side, there has been some error. Okay, the server encountered an error. Fine. So the developer on the server side has made some mistake, and because of which there is an error. Fine. And that's this category, server error. Clear? Okay, so that's the status codes and what they mean, right? So certain headers also depend on status code. Fine. Headers on response side, I think yesterday we had discussed some of them. Fine. So, like what is the server, even that can be found. So there is some header called server colon and the name of the server. It might say Apache so and so, or all those things. Okay. Fine. So this is clear. Fine. The HTTP protocol typically clear, request and there is a response. Fine. When we look at the practical, I'll also try to show that yes, just by using telnet or some simple TCP client, fine, you should be able to try it out on your own also. Fine, giving some writing a request on your own and then seeing what response it gives. Fine, rather than looking at it only through a browser. Fine. Even in browser, actually there are provisions now where you can see exactly what has come, the entire text as it comes, and that can be shown. Browsers have some provision like that. Okay. There are some plugins which can show it to you for in the browser. Okay, fine. So now let's look at the Java API related to using HTTP on the client side. Okay, client side means we are interested in sending a request and receiving a response. Fine. We'll have two sides. Okay, one, see, development has to be done on both ends, right? Client code. Normally there is a client which is typically available, which is nothing but your browser, right? But what does the browser do? Yeah, interact with the server, and then when it receives the response, what does it do? It is meant for rendering, right? Its job is to just, I'll send a request, receive and show it to you. Fine. It has its own way of showing it, and it knows everything how to show it. Fine. Oh, there will be a lot of information in that what it is showing, right? But then how to use that information? Fine. See, another kind of client which I was mentioning yesterday. What was the other client? Crawler. Fine. That's also a HTTP client basically. Fine. But it's not the browser. It's doing the same thing. Fine. It's going to send a request, receive a response. But then what? When it receives the response, fine, the content which it has received, it might do some parsing in that and be able to find out, get some information. And see, for server side developers, most of the time it's being recommended that you should follow proper HTML tags, right? Have proper hierarchy. It's better to use XML format. If it is XML, it is more easily parsable. The information can quite easily be collected. Fine, that is the whole idea there. Fine. So that yes, these clients which are not necessarily meant for displaying, just displaying the content, receiving and displaying the content, they could be used for other processing purpose. And you can have client who can just keep on processing, sending a request, getting a response, and then just keep on processing the information it receives. Retrieve the information, parse and retrieve the information and use it. Fine. Okay, so that's the idea here. So let's see how do we, so we'll first look at this client side code of it, okay, and then we'll be moving on to the server side. Fine, as far as server side is concerned, it's related to Java EE, fine, where one of the specifications is the servlet specification, which we'll have to explore. Okay, fine, so looking at the client side of the Java code, okay, so the Java API, right? Now, one of the classes, now this, some of the classes here you will have in the java.net package. Okay, let's see what are the useful classes here. Your starting point would be a class called URL. You have a class called URL in the java.net package. Okay, another class which will be more useful, okay, is a class called URL connection. Right? This is actually the class, this is an abstract class anyway. Fine, but this is the class which will be used for sending a request and receiving a response. It's useful for both sending a request and receiving a response. Fine, and this is abstract, a specific, this URL connection is not specific to HTTP protocol. Specific to HTTP protocol, you have a subclass of the URL connection called HTTP URL connection. Okay. So these are the three classes which are going to be useful to us. As a client side, just minimum, these are the three classes which you'll be having. And of course, from these things, you'll get input stream for reading the content part, for getting the headers. You'll have APIs for getting the headers and all those things. Fine. So let's see, how do we start? We start with the URL class. Okay. Okay. So a URL is nothing but, yes, what's a URL? A typical URL looks like. Let's try to have a typical URL with as much parts which we can include as possible. Okay. So a typical URL, it could be some protocol, okay, HTTP or HTTPS or FTP or fine, some protocol. So you got a protocol. Okay, I'll keep HTTP, let's say. Yeah. Colon slash slash. Before hostname, can we include something? It's more commonly used with FTP, but you might even have it in HTTP also. Or HTTPS, even with a more commonly maybe with HTTPS. That's a good hint. Yeah, you have your user information. Fine. For example, username colon password. Even colon password you may not specify, then it will prompt for it. And then you say at the rate, at, and then the host. Here comes the host. Okay. Here's your host. Colon, port number. Fine. Optional part though, right? You may not specify colon port number, it would understand by default as port, depending on, because it is HTTP, then it will be 80. Fine. Depending on the protocol, a default port will be used. Then slash resource, then find resource name could then be followed by, yeah, that's part of the resource. Fine, you might have parameters, so that's a query string. Question mark, that's what we call as a query string. Okay, parameter name equal to value and parameter name equal to value, but this we'll call as a query string. And sometimes your resources also have another part. You'll have resource, okay, you'll have resource and hash followed by a reference. And you can have a reference also. Hash home, hash something. When you're aware, right? In a HTML page, you can create references within the page itself. So it can go to that reference directly. Okay, fine. So typical URL can look like this. Okay. So how do we create an object of URL? Fine. There's just yeah. To create an object of URL, you have got various constructors. Okay. Fine. What we can do here is we can have, it can be created by using a simple string. Fine. This is nothing but some URL specification. Okay, what this URL specification is specifying? Oh, it might be some, this I have used, the example which I have tried is nothing but giving all various parts of it. But fine, it may be some partial things. It might only, it might say protocol can be even file colon, yeah, protocol, file colon also, file colon slash, referring to some local file. Fine, HTTP colon, FTP colon. So some protocol, fine, this is a valid URL, some valid URL specification that can be used for creating object of URL. What does the constructor do here? You give a URL, what does the constructor do? The constructor parses this string. Whatever string you have used in the URL specification, it will parse a string, try to find out what is the host, what is the port, what is the protocol, fine, the various parts of this, it will try to identify and keep that information in an object. So URL object typically has information about, what are the information? Fine, we'll come back to the constructor, but what are the information we'll have in the URL? First thing, protocol. So in URL class, you got a method called get protocol. To return a string. Then second part, get user info, returning a string. get host returns a string. Get port returns a int. Yeah. What else? Have port, then get path to return a string. Get ref to return a string. Get query string. Fine. It doesn't do the parsing of parameters for us. Fine. That parsing of parameter, who needs that? It's the server side which will need that. Yeah. So in the server side API, yes, we'll come across parsing, where the parsing of parameter would have been done for us. Clear? URL. So what is a URL object? It's nothing but having all this information. An object with all these things as attributes. So you got getter methods. To create the object, you have various constructors. One I'm just shown is a typical constructor like this. Sometimes you create a URL, because what is this? Basically, it's referring, the resource is nothing but some kind of a path. Now, relative to that path, you might like to create one more URL on the same machine, but a different directory, maybe a subdirectory within whatever this resource is referring to. Okay, fine. So if you want to do that, you can still create a URL by specifying an existing URL and using a string which is relative to this URL. So you have your specification relative to a given URL. You can create URL object like this. Fine. And then you will also find some constructors. For example, you'll have another constructor which says, okay, you can give me a string for the host, string for the host, string, integer for the port, a string for the path. Fine. So some such constructors exist where certain parts, some of the commonly used information that can be used just for creating the object of URL. And creating object of URL. And you can have a look at the in the API for the constructors. Not all of them. No, not all of them. You can use the specification where all information may be available, and you can use that typical URL with all kinds of information. Yes, then it will have everything. The other constructors which are there, I think some is there which is taking protocol, host. I didn't find anyone taking the user info, fine, or even the query string. Yeah, fine. But the point here is, yes, our object has all this information. It's just nothing but a URL object is just collection of all this information. Okay, and then we have certain more methods here. One more useful method. There are a few other methods which we can use, but let me move. Fine, let's move to the next method. Okay, so these are nothing but methods which are giving information from the object itself. Now, what we have is another method called, we have a method called open connection. The name is slightly misleading. This is the method which returns us the object of URL connection. Yeah. Coming to our next class in this discussion, that is about URL connection. Yeah, what does this mean? What do you think this method does? The name is suggestive of something. It says open connection. Yeah, the method says open connection. So what does it do? It has the information, host, port, everything. What do you think it does?
check the connection or help us connect, get the information of the host, full information.
Information about the host. Getting information about host means what? Okay. The name suggests what?
Opening the connection.
It has to make a connection. What is there? The host is there, port is there, everything is available in the URL object, and when say, oh, open the connection, so you'll get a feeling that it's going to create a connection. No connection is done here. When it says open connection, the method name is slightly misleading. It's not making any connection. It's just creating an object of URL connection for us. It's only allocating a URL connection object for us. Fine. Have a look at what is there in this URL connection object. Fine. That's what we should try to understand. That's the important part. Fine. As a client side code, what is it that I would like to do? As a client, what do we do?
First, make a connection.
First, make a connection. Even before making a connection, I need to be clear with my request. I must set up my request properly, then ask it to make a connection and send my request. You have seen there is a HTTP request. There's a typical format for the HTTP request, and then send this. Wait for a response. Response comes. Analyze the response. Take the response once it has fine. Clear? That's the way we would like to do. So that's what exactly this URL connection is all about. So let's have a look at this URL connection. Sorry. We have the look at the URL connection. The URL connection is a big object, fine, and it has two parts within the object itself. You can think of it as two parts. Yeah, what are the two parts in the URL connection? What do you think are the two parts of the URL connection? That's a big object. Let's say, oh, that's my big object. This is my URL connection object, and it has two parts within this. There's one part, and that's the other part. Yeah. What are the two parts we are interested in? We have space for the request related information, and we have space for the response related information. Before making a connection, see, why not make a connection straight away? Before making a connection, I would like to set up my request. I would like to set up what method to use, what header should go. Fine, you would like to set up your headers. You would like to set up your method. It should be get, it should be post. Fine, set up the content if you like. All that. So it has space for all this. So this is a big object, I said. It has space for the request area. You have methods in URL connection which will help you to set up the request part. Fine. You will have setter and getter methods related to information about request. Whereas, what will be done? See, the typical cycle goes like this. You say open connection, you get this object created for us. It's nothing but just creating this object for us. Now, this object is initially in the setup state. The object is currently in a setup state. In the setup state, you will be allowed to set up your request. Set the values of headers. Set the content. You want to populate content? Fine. How do I populate content? Okay. So for that, yes, what do I need? Some way to populate. There'll be some area where a buffer would be there for the content part. There's some buffer for the content part. You would like to write into that buffer. And therefore, what is available in the URL connection is an output stream. Output stream is used for populating the buffer of the request. You write into this output stream, it will be going into the buffer of the request. Okay, fine. So you have methods. I think the method is get output stream or open output stream. I think it's get output stream. Okay, so you can use that get output stream. You get an output stream, use the right method on that, it will be populated into the content area of the request. You have method called set request, setter method to set request property. Yeah, set request property. That's nothing but your header. And you have set request property to set up the header. Okay, set request property, content type, and name and value. Fine, name and value of the property. So request, you have got request property, which mean actually the headers. Okay. Fine. Now, one thing I mentioned was URL connection. What you will get is a URL connection, but if you have used HTTP as the protocol, if you have specified HTTP as the protocol, URL connection as such is a abstract class. What you will be getting is the object of the subclass of URL connection called the HTTP URL connection. Fine. So if it is HTTP URL connection, you can do the casting. Fine. What was the URL? How was the URL created? By specifying protocol as HTTP. URL connection comes from a URL. What was the URL having in the protocol? HTTP. And therefore, when you say open connection, the object which is returned, the return type is URL connection, but you can always cast it into HTTP URL connection. HTTP URL connection has methods specific to HTTP protocol, and in HTTP protocol, we can talk about a method of the request. You can say the method is get or the method is post. I would like to set up my request method. So that can be done in this state. Yeah. So typical thing is, yes, open connection, you get a URL connection object, use the setter methods, you can cast it into HTTP URL connection if required. Fine. And then set up the headers if you want to change them. Fine. Set up the request method. Fine. Resource is already specified through the URL, so you won't be allowed to change the resource. Fine. Protocol will be decided by that API itself. You can't change the protocol version, but you can specify the headers. You can specify the content. You have set protocol HTTP. Protocol version should be HTTP 1.1. So that's in the API. Yes. Right. So if you want to populate your content part of the request, fine, get the output stream. So you have output stream available, but there's something more. It's not that by default it will allow you to write into the content area. If you actually want to write into the content area of the request, you actually will have to do one more method. There's a method called, so in the URL connection itself, there's a method to enable the output stream. Set do output. There's a set and get. Set do output. Sorry. Boolean. There's a method like this. Fine. Enable or disable the output of the, so this is returned. There's a setter method. So you'll have to just say set do output true. Fine. Just to enable the use of output stream. Once you say set do output true, then you can ask for output stream. Returns output stream. Fine. And then you can write into the content. Anything what you would like to set up as the content, that can be now given. Okay. Clear? And then what? Oh, you set up your request. What should be the second thing? Make a connection. Send a request and make a connection. So sending a request, making a connection, and getting the response from there, from the server. Okay, all that is done in a method called connect. You can call the connect method. The state now changes to connected. This was in setup state. It has now changed to connection. Right? So in this state, what is happening? Yes, when we call the connect method, what will happen? The information in the request area would be used for sending a request to the server. Fine. So send request to the server. Fine. Wait for response, and whatever response come, populate this. It has the content part also. Yeah. There's a buffer where the content would be received. The headers, the status code, everything is going to be available in the URL connection object. Or it should be, because it's more typical about HTTP, you should be going for HTTP URL connection. Probably the status codes, the information about status code would be in the HTTP URL connection. Fine. So this single class, oh, that's it's a big object, URL connection. That's the one which has the method for setting up request related things and getting response related things. You'll have a method called get status, no set status. You don't set the status. What is the status received? Fine. You want to read the content. How do I read the content? Get input stream. The content received here. Fine. This was to be populated. So you have an output stream to enable you to write into the request related buffer. In the response which has been received, it has come from the server. So you are now interested in reading out from this, and that's where you get an input stream to read the buffer, the content buffer. And you will have a method called get input stream, like get output stream. There's also a method called get input stream. Right? See, you have got all the methods. You've got getter methods, get methods for getting the headers, getting the response headers. When you'll have typical methods, get header. Okay. Fine. And you'll have method called get status to know the status. When mainly you might be interested more in the content part, so a method for get input stream, allowing to read the content which has been received from the server. Okay. Fine. Now a typical thing which you should now understand. The state has now changed to connected, right? And it has received everything. Now in this state, you can't do any method on the request side by saying, I want to change the value of the method. You can't set that. One single object, one single class, URL connection has all methods. methods related to request, setting up request, method related to fetching information from the response part. Okay, now someone tries this. Someone says, okay, I have just I've done the open connection. I've got the URL connection object. On this URL connection object, I don't do anything else. I straight away say, get me the status code because that method is available. What do you think happens? You're not asked it to connect. Without asking it to connect, you're saying, oh, give me the status straight away. You're not even set up the request. And you're saying, give me a request, give me this status. Or open that input stream for me. You have the get input stream. And saying, oh, I want to read that buffer of the response. Yeah, you're using methods which are getting information from this part of the object. What happens in that case? What do you think should happen? And you think it's error? No. What it does, if you see, this is maintaining its state. It sees the state is a setup state, and you have used a method which requires information from the response. In that case, I'll make a connection, fetch the information, and give you the information. I have to change my state to connected state. Fine, I'll make my connection. It's like calling the connect method immediately and then answering your query. That's how it is done. That's what happens. That's what is typical about this class. Yeah, it will do that connection. You just say open input stream. Okay, fine. Here it is. And I'll make the connection. Fine. But if it has already made a connection and you use any method here, yes, its information is already available here, and I'll just give the information for you because connection was earlier done. So it's one URL connection object making connection only once, not again and again. Fine. It's about sending a request, receiving a response, and then answering your queries related to the response. If you straight away ask for any query related to the response, okay, I'll do it immediately. You fine. So you may not call the connect method. Fine. It's up to you. Fine. You won't directly do it because many times you might like to set up your request first. Fine. It's not always. Fine. Okay. Oh, it's fine to use the get method. By default, the initial method would be get. The resources, everything is according to how the URL was created. Headers, there will be only default few headers. You would like to set up a few headers. That you won't be able to do if you straight away go for get method. You won't be able to change from get to post. And so it has a setup state. That's an important thing. Fine, understand. Yeah, there is a setup state, and that state can change if you use any method related to the response, fetching information from the response. Fine. Clear? The big object. Fine, has both request part, response part. Request is to be set up, response will be after the connection is done, then it is populated. And how it will connect? You can ask for information from the anything related to the response. Okay, I'll make a connection. If I have not connected. If I have already been connected, I have the information, I can give it to you. Clear? One URL connection object makes a connection only once. Fine. Clear on this? So now, yeah, you should try out. Fine. Look in the API for all the methods. I have not discussed methods. But yes, because exact method names I don't remember, but yeah, you should be able to explore them in the API. Okay. Get header method is for header on the response. Header of the get header would be here. Fine. It would be set request property, and fine, it's known as request property, which is the header of the request. We have header on both ends. Fine. For the content here, you have an output stream to populate the content of request. You have an input stream to fetch the content of the from the response part. Okay. There is also a method called get content. See, certain headers are typical. Fine. Headers describing the content. For example, there is always a content type header. So you can use the method get content type directly to get a string rather than using get header and passing a parameter which says content type. My header is content type. Clear? There are certain popular header names for which you directly have a method. Okay. You don't have to say get header and then pass parameter as content type. Fine. So look at those things in the API. Fine. Okay. So yeah, some exercise. Not a typical exercise, but okay. The exercise here would be you can think of some image or anything which you may like to download. You should have a URL for it. Have a URL and download some content. Fine. Fine. For example, you might have HTTP. Your URL might be created as HTTP colon. Okay, a few more things. Yeah, this reminds me of some a few more methods in the URL class now. Okay, we have methods. I mentioned about method called get input stream being available in URLConnction. We have the method open input stream in the URL itself. If you use the method open input stream in the URL, what it does? It does an open connection and then get input stream and returns the input stream for us from the URL connection. So though you are using URL, it would actually create a URL connection for us, okay, and fetch the, give you an input stream to fetch the content. No, different class altogether. Fine, but URL connection is related to a specific URL object, right? It's for a URL object. So you could have, for example, HTTP colon slash slash maybe some website slash some path may be there and images or something and something dot jpg, and that might be your URL to fetch an image and just download and put it in a file, and then you can open it locally, create a file output stream, read from this input stream and write to the output stream. You can use some of the methods from core Java, some class from core Java, echoer, fetching from input stream, writing to an output stream. Nothing but just a thread to fetch from input stream, write to a output stream. You could take help of that straight away. Fine, does this. Fine. Or fine. But it's just nothing but reading from an input stream, writing to the output stream till you get the end of file. And flush it. Fine, do a flush. Okay. So download some any URL you can try to download, fine, and then you can experiment and look at the status codes. What happens to the status code when you say google.com? Receive the status code, receive the headers, look at the header, the location header has come or not. Fine. Or if you have some information, if you got, but then it would require XML parsing. Fine. If you know of some site which gives information, okay, fine, you can write a code to get information. And you can do there are certain sites where they'll say, okay, you enter the what do you say, phone number or something, and then they have a exactly typical format of the response. Okay, there's one specific format of the response. That means your HTML output is almost identical all the times. So there'll be a specific place for specific information, specific offset from the beginning of the file where you will fetch certain information. So you can even try to rely on that and try to fetch information, build some database of your own. Okay, fine. Something which involves parsing. If you can do parsing of the text which comes, yes, you can do that. Fine. So try some such thing for the exercise here. Okay. Fine. So any questions now related to the client side? This is what is typically used as client side for HTTP protocol. URL connection, and HTTP URL connection. URL connection has both the parts. Okay, so tomorrow we can continue. Fine. Exercise when you will do. कल exercise करना है. Okay.